Hi, and welcome to this edition of Nebraska Farm Bureau's Inside Profitability. My name is Heidi Pieper. I'm the field staff for the Southwest region at Nebraska Farm Bureau, and I will be hosting today's event. Inside Profitability is a series of webinars and podcasts focusing on producer profitability. The topics we discuss here are brought forward by our members. They've been identified as being important in managing and maintaining economic viability in farms and ranches. We hope this series will be informative and bring value to managing your operation. If you have topics you would like to see discussed through this series, please reach out. Our goal is to cover what matters to our members, and we're always looking for ideas and feedback. You can get a hold of me at heidip@nefb.org. On today's webinar, we're going to discuss understanding and utilizing EPDs in cattle. It's the time of year where mailboxes start to fill up with bull sale catalogs and flyers, and it's always enjoyable to look through the bulls, but it's known that so much more goes into selecting a herd sire than just a pretty picture. Today, we will be given an opportunity to better understand how specific EPD data is derived. This will allow us to make better informed decisions and achieve more predictable results when working towards the goals of our operation. Certain traits are directly tied to your profitability as a producer, and with input costs and interest rates that continue to rise, it's important to utilize every avenue available to enhance your economic success. Everybody wants a sleep all night Cavignese bull, and it can be tempted to chase a specific EPD like birth weight, but it's important to keep in mind a balance across EPDs so you aren't making sacrifices in other areas. I'm looking forward to learning some ways that we as producers can determine what value to place on certain EPDs and how to integrate the data when making our selections. I'm excited to have Dr. Matt Spangler online to break EPD information down for us and walk us through how to put the numbers to work in a way that not only fits what our operations are trying to achieve, but also enhances our profitability. Dr. Spangler, thank you for taking the time to visit with us today.
Well, thank you. It's certainly my pleasure. I put on the title slide here my email address, so certainly encourage anyone to reach out to me directly with any questions about anything I cover in this webinar or really anything beef cattle genetics centric. I've been a faculty member at UNL in the Animal Science Department for close to 15 years now, and I'm a professor of animal breeding and genetics and an extension beef genetics specialist. And in that role, I've greatly appreciated the opportunity to interact with clientele across the state of Nebraska and really beyond. So I believe this is the task, and somebody stated it far better than I could. For the simplicity on this side of complexity, I wouldn't give you a fig, but for the simplicity on the other side of complexity, for that I would give you anything I have. So the complexity is understanding the plethora of data that is in those bull sale catalogs. So for people that have piled through them or a semen catalog, and understand how complex the task can seem at the surface, they understand the desire for simplicity. And so that's what I'm going to try to achieve today, is to provide perhaps the underpinning of what these tools actually are and how we can best utilize them. So in a nutshell, these are the sources of data that go into EPDs or expected progeny differences. Records from relatives, you can think about ancestors, sires and dams, grandparents, records from an individual themselves. So what a bull actually weighed at birth or weaning, yearling, etc. Over the past decade, we've actually been able to augment genomic data into these tools, and I'll discuss more about that later. And then if the animal becomes a registered parent, records from descendants, so their offspring and grand progeny. But as we know, not all data are equally informative, and I'd ask you to kind of separate in your mind the difference between data and information. Particularly as you think about a bull sale catalog, there's a difference between the data that's in there and information that's actually useful to make a decision. When we talk about the calculation of EPDs, data are actually weighted proportional to their contribution in determining an animal's genetic merit. And the way that data is weighted depends on the heritability of a trait. So think about mature cow weight, which is highly heritable, meaning that a record for mature cow weight tells us more about an animal's genetics for that trait than does a single record for something like heifer pregnancy, which is lowly heritable. Kinship, so how closely animals are related. Now, kind of the genetic variation among markers due to genomic information, correlations among traits. So the nice thing about the way these tools are calculated is that I can get a genetic prediction or an EPD for a trait like yearling weight simply by having a birth weight record, because birth weight and yearling weight are genetically correlated. Data can also be weighted based on the confidence we have in the record, and I'll discuss a little bit more what I mean by that. So as an example, in my last point, the confidence in the record, these are 4 plots of birth weight records. And so in the top left, what I'll call panel A, those are animals identified as having what I'll call real birth weights. So birth weights recorded using a digital scale. The top right, panel B, are animals identified as having birth weights as measured by a hoof tape. That measures the circumference of an animal's hoof and then makes a prediction about how much the animal must weigh. Panel C is what I call fabricated, which I understand is a bit bold because that suggests I know the intent. But what I can say is they're birth weight records that don't follow a distribution that I would expect. You'll notice there's not very much variation, and we never see anything over a certain threshold. And then D is what I'll just call dirty. You see spikes at certain intervals, like 5 or 10-pound intervals. And so where this came about is I asked a former postdoctoral student that worked with me, can we identify after the fact birth weight records from large beef breed associations that fall in these 4 categories? And if we could identify those, could we then weight them in the calculation of EPD? So a birth weight record collected with a digital scale was more informative or counted more than something that came from a contemporary group that had dirty observations or were measured with a hoof tape. And so that is a sophisticated way of saying these data that go into EPDs are actually quality control checked. There are various ways of doing that. I've pointed out one that's maybe a bit more extreme that uses what we call machine learning. And people are familiar with this, even if they haven't heard the phrase. If you watch Netflix, if your credit card's ever called you to say, hey, did you actually make this charge? They're users of machine learning or artificial intelligence, right? The Netflix recommendations. You didn't tell Netflix the type of movies you watch. They learned that from what you watched. Fraud protection, right? I had a call one time because I bought a bunch of extra large overalls from a store in Maryland. I don't visit Maryland regularly, and I'm 5'7", so that didn't fit, right? We actually utilize this methodology to make sure that the data flowing into genetic evaluation with the example of birth weight is actually reliable, because I've heard often that the figures don't lie, but liars figure, with the insinuation that people kind of fudge the data to make EPDs come out the way they want them to. And I'm here to tell you that there are actually sophisticated checks in place to make sure that that doesn't happen. Along with accounting for the different sources of information that can inform EPDs, we also adjust out known sources of what I'll just call environmental variation. So the herd the animal was born in, the year that they were born in, the season that they were born in, different management groups. And this is important for seed stock producers. If I have a group of bulls and I think that a couple of them look special, whatever special means, and I pull them to the side and I feed them more because I want to take them to Denver or to Cattlemen's Classic, whatever, that's a different management group, and they're no longer comparable to the rest of the bulls. So Forming management groups is very important. Sex, right? So males tend to weigh more than females. Age of the dam, young cows don't milk as heavy as older cows do. So these are sources of variation that we try to adjust the actual phenotypes or records for in the genetic evaluation process. So with that said, it begs the question, why not use actual weights to decide which bulls I want to buy? Because that's commonly done. Producers look for a calving ease bull and they try to select bulls that themselves have the lowest birth weight. The problem with that is that the actual measurements are influenced by numerous factors that are non-genetic in nature, and I just mentioned some of them. And those non-genetic sources of variation will not be passed on to the offspring. So I could feed bulls heavier to make them bigger, but the fact that I fed them more isn't going to benefit their offspring. Well, what about ratios then? So ratios ignore all information except the individual's own record in relation to its contemporaries. So I mentioned before this weighting process, taking into account the phenotypes or records of relatives. Ratios ignore all that additional information. And another point with ratios is that they can't be compared beyond that particular contemporary group, because kind of the crux of a ratio is how does an animal perform compared to the average of their contemporaries. So that makes them only useful within a contemporary group. That means the most useful tools are these: expected progeny differences. And expected means that we're making some prediction about the future. Progeny, we're talking about offspring, and difference implies a comparison between animals. So what is our expectation about how a bull's offspring might compare to the offspring of another bull? That is what an expected progeny difference is. I get asked often, well, a bull had an EPD of 50 for a given trait, say weaning weight. How much should the bull have weighed, or will the bull weigh at weaning? That's not what EPDs are meant to do. They're meant to compare bulls or animals in general based on how the average of their offspring will compare. Average is an important thing, and we'll get to that later, because obviously one bull can have a bad calf, even though genetically they're superior. So we're talking about averages over large groups of offspring. So this is kind of a very small but practical example. We have this one bull that has 5 calves, and you assume those 5 calves are born across different contemporary groups, different herds, years, seasons. The values on the far right then are how each calf differed, let's say for the trait of weaning weight, compared to the average of their contemporaries. So the calf at the top weighed 30 pounds more at weaning than the average of his contemporaries. The calf third down weighed 10 pounds less than the average of his contemporaries. So as a bull sires a lot of calves, we kind of get on average how his offspring are performing compared to their contemporaries. In this particular example, on average, this bull sires calves that weigh 10 pounds more than the average of their contemporaries. And we would take that value then and weight it as a function of the heritability of the trait of weaning weight and the relationship of this particular bull to his calves. And that becomes, in a very simplistic form, an EPD. For the purposes of this, I'm not going to go through the complex matrix algebra that actually underpins what we do for routine genetic evaluation. For those that want to learn about that, I teach a PhD level class, and I'm sure that we could go in to painstaking detail about it. But what I want to try to portray is that at a high level, this is what EPDs are. And I also want to illustrate or mention that a sire can produce offspring that exhibit more than 3/4 of the diversity of the entire population. That's a complicated way of saying that if I want to try to increase uniformity in my calf crop, buying related sires, an example, half-sibling bulls, is not the best way to do it, because those half-sibling bulls could actually be genetically very different. The far better approach would be buying bulls that are similar in their EPDs for the traits that I want to improve uniformity in. I want to go through an example now of why a good bull can have bad calves and a bad bull can have good calves. So cattle have generally 30 pairs of chromosomes, and half of that pair, let's say the yellow, is inherited from the sire, and the other half, the orange, inherited from the dam. Each chromosome has about 100 million base pairs, which means we have about 3 billion base pairs per animal. There's not a test over this, but the reason I mention this is as we talk about whole genome sequencing in animals, we're talking about getting millions to billions of DNA variants per animal. So if you hear about the big data problem in animal sciences, this is one example of that. So let's assume we have these three animals now that we wish to compare. On the far right, I have an EBV. That's a breeding value. That's the genetic merit of an individual. And then the EPD, the expected progeny difference, is simply the breeding value cut in half, okay? Because an animal only passes on half of their genetics to the next generation. That's why we use progeny differences. So if we assume this was a growth trait that we hire as better, the top animal would be the best and the second animal would be the worst. However, through this kind of phenomenon, which we call Mendelian sampling, there's this random shuffling of alleles from one generation to the next, meaning that a sire at every spot along the genome is only going to pass along one allele. So you can imagine this first animal, when a mating is made, he passes on only the bad alleles or the bad forms of the gene. So he passes on a -2, a -3, a -4, and then at the last spot, he passes on a +5. So through bad Mendelian sampling, bad luck, a good bull can produce a bad calf and vice versa. And that's expected. That's why, as we look at how well do EPDs perform, we look at large groups of offspring and not compare single calves to determine, are these tools actually doing what we expect them to do? And the reality is these tools aren't new, right? So to my knowledge, the first EPD, or really breeding value, published in beef cattle was in 1970 in the Lytton-Charlet bull sale catalog. And Lytton's worked with a famous professor, Richard Wilhelm at Iowa State, to do that. So you can go back over 50 years to find evidence of these tools being used in beef cattle. The first Beef Breed Association that performed what we'd call a genetic evaluation was the American Simmental Association in the early 1970s. And those EPDs were calculated at Boeing, simply because that's where the computational resources, the computers existed to do it at the time. So that's to say, if people think, well, these are kind of new, I don't understand them. I understand if more information is needed to feel comfortable, but don't think this is new technology, because it's been around for a long time in one form or another. And they work. It is beyond contestation that these tools work. What these values are regression coefficients. And it basically answers the question, for every 1 unit change I make in sire EPD, how much change do I see in offspring phenotype for the traits of birth weight, weaning weight, yearling weight, and milk? Milk is really maternal weaning weight. We don't milk beef cows if we can avoid it. So it's the maternal contribution to a calf's weaning weight. The expected value of that's 1. So every 1 unit change I make in sire EPD, I should see a 1 unit change in average offspring phenotype. And these values are all very close to 1. So it says to me that EPDs are working the way we expect them to. And these values you'll see here, I have pooled. That means it's pooled over roughly the 18 beef breeds that the U.S. Meat Animal Research Center, that's U.S. MARC, evaluates routinely in their germplasm evaluation project. I would point out, though, since we're talking about the U.S. Meat Animal Research Center, they also publish on an annual basis this relatively large table, and I'm not going to go through this in detail, but these are what we call a crossbreed EPD adjustments, meaning that if I want to compare a Hereford bull to an Angus bull, I can't do that directly. And so I need to utilize the values in these tables to do that. People that want to find these tables can find them at the Beef Improvement Federation website, beefimprovement.org. But I'm going to take you through an example of how this might work. And to do that, I'm going to compare a Simmental bull and a Hereford bull. And what I have in the columns are traits of birth weight, weaning weight, yearling weight, and milk. I have the Simmental bull's actual EPD in the first row. And then the first row for Hereford, I have the Hereford bull's actual EPD. Now, these aren't directly comparable, but I can use the values in the previous slide, and I look up what is the Simmental value for birth weight, for weaning weight, for yearling weight, and for milk. And I do the same thing for Hereford. And I basically add those adjustment factors to the respective bull's EPDs. And then I put them both on the same base so I can directly compare them. The reason this is important for producers that are buying bulls of multiple breeds is that without doing that, if we look at milk, an example, I would have assumed that the Simmental and the Hereford bull were identical in their genetic potential for milk, but that is obviously false. Once I use the crossbreed EPD adjustment factors, I can see that in fact they differ substantially. So I mentioned before this notion of kinship. It's generally thought of as pedigree, and it's critical for genetic prediction. So that's really the backbone of being able to calculate EPDs because it allows the flow of information among relatives. So you can imagine that for a young bull, I don't have a weaning weight record on him, but the parents, the sire and the dam, do have weaning weight records. And so I can inform the EPD of that young bull based on the records from his relatives. And the closer the kinship, the closer the relatives are, the heavier weighting that their respective records receive, right? So in other words, having records on parents means more than having records on grandparents. I think that makes sense. This idea of the flow of information through pedigree enables not only the prediction of progeny from parents or vice versa, but also genetic prediction for sex-limited traits. In beef cattle, we may think of female fertility, so getting a genetic prediction for heifer pregnancy on a bull. The great case is thinking about dairy cattle, right? One of the traits of primary interest in dairy cattle is milk yield. Well, bulls don't milk, so we have to inform their genetic values for milk based on how their daughters and how their dams perform. So this is a simplified 3-generation pedigree. And what I have in the table are the values of, think of it as relatedness. So individual 1 and 7, that represents a parent offspring pair. And if you go to the table, the value is 0.5. It makes sense. A parent and an offspring, 50% related. Individual 1 and 10, that's an individual and their grandparent. And we go to the table, that value's 0.25 or 25%. That makes sense too. So pedigrees, when they don't have heir and there's not inbreeding, they provide an expectation on average. What would the relationship be between two individuals? Now, I mentioned the without heir bit. The nice thing about genomics is it allows us to correct any uncertain parentage. We generally think of that as paternity, but it can resolve maternity as well. If you look at this very simple example, I have 3 bulls and I have an offspring, the progeny. And the question is, which of these bulls is the most likely sire of this calf? And in my small example, I have two what we'd call loci, two spots in the genome, one represented by a big A, or one represented by A and one represented by B. So from this example, we could say, well, bull A can't be the sire of this calf because at the B locus, all he can pass on is the big B, and all the calf has is a little b, so he can't be the sire. Bull C, at the A locus, all he can pass on is a little a, but all the calf has is a big A, so he can't be the sire. That makes the most likely candidate then bull B. For producers that actually do this kind of testing, it's important to have all candidate sires represented, right? So every natural service sire that could have gotten in there, every possible straw in the semen tank. And in practice, we do this with far more than 2 genetic markers. Standard panels or tests have upwards of 200 DNA markers, and some beef breed associations actually employ tens of thousands of DNA markers to do this. But this is one way through the advent of genomic technology that we've been able to ensure that pedigrees are indeed accurate. Taking this a bit farther, though, genomics allows us to resolve relationships further than parent offspring. So this slide actually is using 50,000 DNA markers across a multitude of individuals, and it represents grandparent relationships to individuals. Now, if you think about the small pedigree example I showed you, we expect that value to be 25%. And this red bar shows the average here, and it's pretty much 25%. But there's a pretty nice bell-shaped distribution ranging from about 0 to 0.5. See, grandparents and individuals on average are related by 25%, but truly that value could be anywhere between 0 and 0.5. We know that to be the case, but until using genomics, we weren't able to actually observe that. So genomic technology allows us to better assign relationships among individuals in a population, and by doing so, more correctly weight the phenotypic records, which in turn leads to increases in the accuracy of EPDs. This is another way to actually see how genomics has increased the accuracy of EPDs, and it's the idea of progeny equivalence. I have several traits here: calving ease direct, birth weight, weaning weight, yearling weight, maternal calving ease, milk, stayability, that's a measurement of reproductive longevity, and then carcass marbling. 3 beef breed associations: Angus, Hereford, and International Genetic Solutions, which is a large multi-breed beef cattle partnership. Don't compare across breeds here. The way I've set up this slide kind of encourages you to do that, but that's not the idea. If we just look at Angus here, for birth weight, the value is 21. What that means is that if I genotype a young non-parent bull, I can increase the accuracy of his birth weight EPD to the same level as if he'd already sired 21 calves that have birth weights recorded. That's a fairly substantial increase in accuracy for young animals, particularly if you think about a trait like stayability, where the value is 15. That says before a bull has ever sired a calf, the accuracy of his stayability EPD is the same as if he already has 15 daughters out there in production. So that's the primary benefit of genomics, is it allows us more information earlier on so we can make more informed selection decisions. Here's another way to think about that. It's the idea of possible change. So if we have a Gelbvieh bull that has a calving ease EPD of 9, lowly accurate, so like a yearling bull, we could actually form what I'll call a confidence interval around that EPD, to where we could say we're about 2/3 confident his true genetic value for calving ease is somewhere between 3 and 15. That's a pretty wide range. But if we were to genotype this bull and dramatically increase the accuracy of his calving ease EPD, then we basically narrow up that confidence interval. That's another way of thinking about adding additional confidence in the true genetic value of seed stock animals by employing genomic technology or by genotyping. And basically what we're doing is increasing the rate of genetic change. So this equation represents the change in breeding value or the change in genetic value per unit of time. And it's related to this R, the accuracy of the tools we use to select individuals. The I, which is selection intensity. Think about how choosy we are and which animals get to be parents. The amount of genetic variation that exists for that trait. And then in the bottom, there's this big L, that's generation interval, or the average age of the parents when the next generation is born. In beef cattle, that's about 4 to 5 years of age. And so genomics allows us to increase the accuracy of EPD, which means that we can use younger sires with more confidence. Those two things together can dramatically increase the rate of genetic change. And there's no better example of that than in dairy cattle, where they've made tremendous changes in how quickly they can change traits. So for seed stock producers, that's the advantage. You can make faster genetic progress. For commercial bull buyers, buying bulls that have been genomically tested mitigates risk. It mitigates the risk of having made the wrong selection decision. So let's talk just a little bit about the decision-making process. As you go out to buy bulls, hopefully the bull you buy has a head. The picture here doesn't. But you've got a lot of things to choose from. So what breed are you going to use? You could kind of go based off of perceived strengths, preferably quantified differences. And the U.S. Meat Animal Research Center that I mentioned has a long-standing project to evaluate breeds so that we can have a clear current picture of how breeds rank and compare. The breeder, which breeder are you going to use? Well, you could go based on reputation or popularity. I view it as any other vendor. You want value and you want service, right? So I think of it as seed stock vendors, and I'd encourage you to think about that way. Data, right? So visual appraisal, qualitative traits, be it color, horn polled status, the actual phenotypes, ratios, EPDs, economic selection indexes, which we'll talk about. There's a lot of data in a bull sale catalog. The stuff that's actually informative at making a decision are the EPDs and selection indexes, right? Even though the footnote in the catalog says he's a really good bull, that doesn't matter, right? It does not matter. What matters is their genetic potential. And it's the genetic potential conditioned on what your objectives are. So I encourage people to set up a breeding objective, which is really a detailed description of your operational goals. How are replacements going to be procured? Do you purchase them or produce them on ranch? How and when are animals going to be sold? That identifies your source of revenue, because it's different if you sell at weaning or retain animals through the feedlot. Do you have any management or environmental constraints? Right? If you have another job in town where you can't be there to provide assistance at calving, all of a sudden that trait becomes more important to you. So I know it may sound silly to put pen to paper and write this out, but it helps keep you grounded in terms of what you need, what drives the net revenue or net profit really of your operation, so that when you do go buy bulls, you buy things that ensure that you're going to march forward in terms of improving profitability. Once you've done those things, it comes down to individual selection. And I'd tell you that sire selection is a capital investment in genetics, right? You're buying genetics. And selection should be placed on the genetic value of an animal as a potential parent, right? Just because somebody else thinks the bull's good doesn't mean he's good for you. So it's all about selecting genetics that have the potential to increase your net profit. And that comes back to a well-defined breeding objective, because what increases my net profit may not increase your net profit. If we just think about the traits of maternal importance, here's kind of a rough list. The traits in blue are the ones that most beef breed associations have EPDs for. The ones in red, we really don't. Maintenance energy requirements, I have starred. Really, that's a function of mature cow weight. That's a big driver. Also, maternal weaning weight or milk plays into that as well, because heavy milking cows need more nutrients even when they're dry. Their visceral organs are bigger, causes an energy sink. So if you're buying bulls to create replacement females, these are some of the traits that you need to consider. However, if you're buying bulls to produce terminal offspring, it's a different list. Again, the traits in blue, most breeds have an EPD for. Traits in black, some do, some don't. Male fertility, the best indicator is scrotal circumference. But the point here is the two lists are different. And if you're trying to do both things simultaneously, then you need to contemplate a very long list of traits, and that can be cumbersome. There are simplified ways to do it, right? If you say, I'm only going to be terminal, I'm going to buy replacement females from somebody who selects from all of these things, that makes it easier. It would even make it easier yet if you bought replacement females that were bred with their, let's say, second, third, or later calf, because somebody's already done the hard work of calving them out the first time, getting them bred back. And oddly enough, those mature females are often priced at a discount compared to bred heifers. So the point is, there's different breeding systems that can enable a simplified list of traits to select on. If we think about all the EPDs that producers have to go through in a bull sale catalog or a semen catalog, it can be confusing. What I've tried to go through here in the next few slides is to provide maybe a bit of context into what these numbers mean. And so I have two bulls, and I have what I generally consider growth traits: birth weight, weaning weight, milk, dry matter intake. Some breeds have EPDs for that, residual feed intake or RFI. And so if we just ask the question, which bull is expected to produce heavier calves? Well, that's bull A, right? He's got the higher birth weight EPD. He's got the higher weaning weight EPD. Which bull is expected to produce daughters who actually wean heavier calves due to their maternal influence? Bull A again, higher milk EPD. Calves that eat less? Well, bull B has actually the lower dry matter intake EPD, so they should eat less. And calves who eat less given the same level of gain, that's what residual feed intake is. And the answer to that question is bull B. So lower residual feed intake means that they eat less for the same level of gain. What I would tell you though, and for some people, residual feed intake seems really important. I would tell you it's not what I would call an economically relevant trait. By economically relevant, I mean I can directly tie a source of cost or a source of revenue. I have never been billed by a feedlot for residual feed intake, right? I always get billed for dry matter intake, always. Silly feedlots, right? So dry matter intake is a source of cost, right? Residual feed intake is really an index. And so I'd encourage you to select for things that directly have a source of cost or directly have a source of revenue. And to that end, birth weight isn't economically relevant either, right? We don't sell calves by the pound at birth. What's economically relevant is, did that calf require assistance at calving? And the trait that gets at that is calving ease, right? So higher calving ease EPD is more desirable. That means less likelihood of calving assistance required. So I would encourage you, of course, not to use actual birth weights in selecting bulls. I would tell you not even to use birth weight EPDs. You should use calving ease EPDs because those are the traits that are economically relevant. So these are things related to fertility. SC is scrotal circumference, HP is heifer pregnancy, and stay is stayability, which again, kind of a proxy for reproductive longevity. So if we ask the question, which bull is expected to produce calves with a larger scrotal circumference? That's bull A. Scrotal circumference is really an indicator of age at puberty in the daughters. So larger scrotal circumference means a younger age at puberty in the daughters. But in Boss Taurus cattle, so think of British breeds, continental breeds, there's really not a relationship between increased scrotal circumference and heifer pregnancy. And that's because for a lot of those breeds, age at puberty really isn't an issue. In fact, we can think about the issue being extreme on the other end, right? Bringing in heifer calves at weaning, they're already bred. So selecting for scrotal circumference as a means of trying to increase fertility of the cow herd probably isn't the most effective thing anymore for Bos Taurus breeds. For producers that use Bos Indicus breeds, think Brahman or Brahman hybrid cattle, then there is a slight positive relationship between scrotal circumference and heifer pregnancy. So the trait we want to focus in on is heifer pregnancy. So which bull is likely to produce daughters that are more likely to conceive as yearlings? That's bull A, because he has the higher heifer pregnancy EPD. What's probably even more important economically, though, is which bull's daughters are going to stay in the herd and be productive over a longer time horizon. And we can get that through stayability, or some breeds call it sustained cow fertility EPDs. And the bull that's more likely to do that is bull B. Okay, he's got the higher stayability EPD. So if you think about cow depreciation cost, it's important to have cows that are able to stay in the herd and be successful, meaning they have a calf each parity for a longer period of time. And stayability is one EPD that can help you select for that. If we think about carcass traits, I have just a few examples here: carcass weight, carcass marbling, and ribeye area. Bull A would produce calves with heavier carcasses on average. Bull A would also produce calves with higher marbling scores and also bigger ribeye areas. I understand that given the way we market cattle, there's interest in increasing marbling scores to try to increase quality grade, but it's really important to be able to benchmark your herd and have some understanding of where you sit currently. Because if the majority of the calves from my herd grade upper 2/3 of choice, there is less incentive for me to increase marbling score than there is for the producer that has calves that consistently grade select. Okay, so it really depends on how your calves perform right now as to which traits you should select on and how much emphasis you should put on them. I'd also tell producers to be knowledgeable consumers. So have some idea what is average for the breed for genetic merit or for EPD for the traits that matter to you, and have some knowledge of what we call percentile rank. So you can get a sense for, is this bull better than 99% of other bulls in the breed, or is he actually pretty bad? And this is just an example. Admittedly, it's dated, but an example from Angus that gives you percentile rank for several different EPDs. So if we want a bull that's in the top 1% of the breed for calving ease, we know what that value has to be. So I'd encourage people to understand, simply because I've received calls in the past that say, I bought a bull that had if we use this table as an example, a weaning weight of 35. Is that good or bad? Well, you already bought the bull, right? So the decision's already made. And it actually was bad if your goal was to increase weaning weight. So it's important to be a knowledgeable consumer. And if you don't know, ask. Your seed stock vendor should know the answers to those questions. So EPD are undoubtedly the best tools to make genetic change, but what do you do with all the EPD? Most breeds have upwards of 20 different EPDs. And I like this quote from a famous animal breeder, Rick Borden from Colorado State, that said, there's no easily accessible, objective way for breeders, particularly in the beef and sheep industries where ownership is diverse and production and environments vary a great deal, to use these predictions intelligently. By predictions, he meant EPDs, and he wasn't saying that beef and sheep producers were stupid. What he was saying was, we've made it too hard because we gave you tools which are extremely valuable, but we didn't provide any direction in how to use them. One way to use them appropriately is to select for multiple traits simultaneously, because it is more than one trait that impacts your profitability. There are various ways to practice multiple trait selection. The best way is through the use of economic index values. And this notion isn't new. The first theory on this was published in the 1940s. The Beef Breed Association that came up with the first economic index value did in the early 2000s. So somewhat new to beef, but not new to other species. Poultry and swine have been doing this far longer than beef cattle have. And the idea is weighting each trait by its economic importance towards a specified breeding objective. So if I sell calves at weaning, there are different traits that should belong in my index compared to if I retain ownership through the feed yard and, let's say, sell on a certified Angus beef based grid. Okay, so the EPDs that go in the index are determined by what your breeding objective is, and there are a lot of them. So this isn't an exhaustive list, but it gets at most of the economic indexes offered by beef breed associations in the US, and I've delineated them as either being terminal or maternal in nature, probably better termed general purpose, meaning you keep back replacement females and you sell some terminal offspring, which probably fits the majority of commercial cow-calf producers. The reason why I've separated these into kind of two buckets is because if I buy bulls and my breeding objective is to sell calves at weaning and retain back my own replacement females, and I sort the bulls that I buy based off their $B, that's dollar beef index in Angus, what I have done is put all my emphasis on post-weaning growth and carcass traits. And none of that exactly fits what drives my profit, right? Nothing about increased weaning weight, nothing about female fertility. So what I'm likely to do is to increase mature cow weight over time, which means that I've increased my source of cost. So these tools, economic index values, are extremely useful, but like any other tool, you have to use the right tool for the right job. Here's an example of how you could use them. This comes from Simmental's all-purpose index. It assumes that I retain my own replacement females and all of their calves are sold gradient yield. I have two bulls here and their API values. If I assume that I'm going to expose those bulls to about 30 cows a year and I'm going to keep them for 4 years, that's 120 exposures over their lifetime. I can take that number of exposures and multiply it by the difference in the bull's index values. Because the difference in their index values gives me a sense for the expectation in net profit per exposure. So I'm just multiplying that by the number of exposures, which means that bull A would be expected to generate close to $3,000 more profit than bull B in my herd over those 4 years. That's important because it gives me a sense for how much more money I should spend for bull A compared to bull B. Right? So if you go back to my thesis that buying bulls is a capital investment in genetics, that means I should expect a return on that investment. So if bull A sells for $10,000 more than bull B, the only way I can recoup that is if I can get more exposures, right? So it's important to think about, when you buy a bull, can I actually recoup the value that I've spent? So it's an investment thought process. And best is a relative concept. A less desirable bull may become the more preferred choice if his sale price discount is large enough. That's a hard pill to swallow, thinking that you buy a bull that's not as good because he was cheaper. And by no means am I advocating that people go out and just buy the cheapest bull they can. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is you need to think about what is the cost and what is the possible return so that I can make a wise investment decision. And we do this in every other aspect of our businesses, but I'm concerned that we don't do it often enough in the bull buying exercise. One thing I do want to highlight is some software that we call IGEN Deck. This is web-based decision support. I have the web address down here. It's offered through the Beef Improvement Federation, so you can click on that and learn more. But what this software does is allows the user to enter information about their own enterprise. So what breeds do they utilize? How do calves currently perform? What's their breeding objective? You know, what point do they sell calves? Do they retain replacement females? Yes or no? And actually calculates a economic index that is specific to the user's situation. So they can use that then to rank bulls based on their net profit potential or differences in net profit for their operation. So this is a way to further customize the bull buying process to make sure that you're actually marching towards improved profitability. So just some summary thoughts here. EPDs work, as I said before, that's beyond contestation. But it's important to be an informed consumer. So know or ask for breed averages. Get a sense for, is this animal better or worse than the average of the breed? Realizing for some traits, below breed average may be okay. So if I'm trying to moderate mature cow size, which a lot of us may need to do, then buying bulls that have a mature cow weight EPD below breed average could be desirable. Because as I say here, bigger is not always better. Use economic selection indexes to simplify the process of selecting bulls, because at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is increase profitability, and those tools help you do that. That requires you to have a well-defined breeding objective and to stick to it. Select the bulls that actually match it. And although I didn't talk about it here, adopt a well-structured crossbreeding program. Okay, not all crossbreeding programs are well-structured. So adopt a well-structured one because it's pretty clear cut that crossbreeding is economically advantageous. And it's something in beef cattle that we have not adopted well. Other species have, and as a consequence, they have advantages over unit cost of production compared to us. I want to point out this, what I think is a useful resource. The Beef Sire Selection Manual. It has chapters, all things genetic related in it, and it's meant for beef cattle producers. You can find it at ebeef.org, where you can download PDF versions of it. If you want a hard copy of it, just shoot me an email. I'll mail you one for free. Not often you can get things for free when you ask for it, but I'd be happy to send you one. And I want to wrap up by pointing out what I think are some useful resources. I mentioned some of them along the way. ebeef.org has things related to beef cattle genetics. Of course, the UNL beef production website, beef.unl.edu. The Beef Improvement Federation, for those not familiar with it, encourage you to learn more about it. Beefimprovement.org. And then the last is the National Beef Cattle Evaluation Consortium, nbcec.org, again, a beef cattle genetics centric resource. So I sincerely appreciate the opportunity to virtually visit with whomever listens to this. And as I said from the start, encourage you to reach out to me via email if anything was unclear, if you have additional questions. So thank you.
Dr. Spangler, thank you again for taking the time to visit with us today. Your talk was a fantastic fit for the goals of our program here. You did a wonderful job of simplifying a complex topic, and you've made me feel better equipped to select for things that are economically relevant when making decisions regarding what sires to purchase or utilize in my own herd. And I hope that those that watch feel the same way. If you are at home and watching and you have additional questions or want more information, like Dr. Spangler said, reach out to him, reach out to us at Nebraska Farm Bureau. We'd love to know what other topics that you'd like to see discussed on Nebraska Farm Bureau Inside Profitability series. Feel free to send suggestions my way at heidip@nefb.org. For those of you interested in rewatching this or any of our past Inside Profitabilities webinars, you can find them on the Nebraska Farm Bureau website, www.nefb.org. Thank you all for tuning in and have a great rest of the day.